3 weeks passed, and I had begun to think of my encounter with the crying lioness as a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I had documented everything in my research notes, but I knew the scientific community would be skeptical. Wild lions don't cry tears of grief. They don't seek human help for medical emergencies. They certainly don't bow in gratitude. But everything changed on August 26th when I stepped outside from my evening observations and found a familiar figure waiting in the jail. Exact same spot dotted was her. The same lioness with the distinctive scar pattern above her right shoulder. But this time she wasn't crying. This time she wasn't carrying a dying cub. Instead, she was leading a healthy, thriving juvenile who could only be the baby I had saved 3 weeks earlier. They had returned not because they needed help, but because they wanted to show me the results of my intervention. The lioness approached within 5 meters of my cabin, and then did something extraordinary. She lay down and began grooming her cub while maintaining eye contact with me. She was demonstrating. She was showing me that her baby was healthy and strong. It was a progress report delivered in the most primal way possible. A mother displaying her thriving offspring to the person who had made survival possible. The cub, now confident and playful, began exploring the area around my cabin. At one point, she wandered to within arm's reach of where I was standing and showed no fear whatsoever. This was unprecedented behavior. Wild lion cubs are taught from birth to avoid humans at all costs. But this little one had been handled by humans during her medical treatment, and her mother had clearly communicated that I was safe. Dr. James Kariuki from the Kenya Wildlife Service arrived 2 days later to investigate reports of unusual lion behavior at my research station. He was initially convinced that I was anthropomorphizing normal animal interactions, but after witnessing the lioness's behavior firsthand, he became one of the most vocal advocates for recognizing the complex emotional lives of wild predators. Breakthrough came when we installed motion-activated cameras around my cabin. The footage revealed that the lioness was visiting my research site regularly, even when I wasn't present. She would approach the spot where she had first waited with her dying cub and then position herself as if she was maintaining a connection to the place where her child's life had been saved. But the most incredible discovery came when we analyzed the social dynamics of these visits. The lioness wasn't coming alone. She was bringing other members of her pride to meet me. She was introducing her family to the human who had saved her cub's life. We were witnessing the formation of an extended social group that transcended species boundaries. The validation came 6 weeks after our initial encounter, when another lioness approached my cabin following a similar pattern. She carried a sick cub, placed it near my door, and then backed away while maintaining eye contact. The behavior had been learned and replicated. The original lioness had taught another mother how to seek human medical assistance. This second cub was suffering from the same type of dehydration and fever that had nearly killed the first one. But her mother's approach was more confident, more trusting. She had been told by the original lioness that the human could heal the wounded. Her faith was based entirely on second-hand information passed down through the lion community. I treated the second cub with the same care I had shown the first. The little male responded well to treatment, and within 48 hours, he was back to normal cub behavior. But what happened during his recovery period was even more remarkable than the original encounter. Both lionesses took up residence around my cabin. They were cooperating in the protection of the sick cub, creating an unprecedented alliance between members of different family groups. Dr. Kariuki documented everything with professional equipment, and his footage became crucial evidence for the scientific community. We were recording the evolution of a new form of interspecies cooperation that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence and cultural transmission. The lioness whose single tear had started it all had become the founder of a medical tradition in lion society. Over the following months, I treated 9 more lion cubs, all brought to me by various members of the local population. Each case followed the same protocol that the original lioness had established. Approach the cabin, present the sick cub, maintain respectful distance, and wait for assistance. They had developed a standardized procedure for seeking human medical help, but the most meaningful development was the ongoing relationship with the lioness who had started this unprecedented medical practice. She continued to visit my research station regularly, bringing her now adolescent daughter to maintain the bond we had formed. These weren't medical visits. They were social calls. She was treating me as an honorary member of her extended family. The young cub I had saved grew into a magnificent juvenile who showed no fear of humans whatsoever. She would approach my cabin with complete confidence, often playing in the area, while her mother rested in the shade. I was witnessing the development of a new generation of lions who viewed humans as potential allies rather than automatic threats. The scientific community took serious notice when Dr. Karayuki published our findings in the journal Animal Behavior. Researchers from around the world came to study what became known as the Chun Protocol. We were documenting behavioral evolution in real time, showing how individual experiences could become cultural knowledge passed down through generations and across pride boundaries. The story reached international attention when National Geographic featured our work in a documentary called The Lioness Who Cried. The footage of that first encounter, when I had found a lioness waiting with a cub, and a single tear, became one of the most viewed wildlife videos in internet history. But for me, the real significance wasn't the fame or recognition, the breakthrough moment came when the original lioness brought her daughter back to my cabin as a young adult. But this time, the daughter wasn't seeking help. She was introducing her own newborn cubs to the human who had saved her life. I watched 3 generations of lions interact with complete trust in human presence and realized we had witnessed something unprecedented in the history of human-animal relationships. The young lioness approached my cabin with the same confidence her mother had eventually developed. She didn't have sick cubs to present, but she wanted me to meet her family. She was continuing the tradition her mother had started, but expanding it beyond medical emergencies to include social bonding and cultural exchange. Today, 18 months after I stepped out for air and found a lioness waiting with a cub and a single tear, my research station has become an unofficial wildlife sanctuary. The Kenya Wildlife Service has provided official recognition and support for this unique conservation program. What started as one mother's desperate tears has grown into a model for human-wildlife medical cooperation. The original lioness is now a grandmother, and her extended family includes cubs from multiple generations, all of whom view me as a trusted healer and protector. When I see her approaching my cabin with that familiar, confident stride, I'm reminded of how far we've come from that first night, when she sat outside my door with her dying baby and a single tear of grief. The trust she showed me that night wasn't just about saving one cub. It was about opening a door between 2 worlds and proving that grief, love, and hope are universal languages that every parent understands regardless of species. Her single tear was the beginning of a conversation that continues to this day and has grown into something that's changing how we think about animal consciousness and emotion. Every evening when I step outside my cabin for fresh air, I scan the darkness, hoping to see that familiar silhouette waiting patiently in the moonlight, because I know that each visit represents another opportunity to strengthen the incredible bond we've built together. A bond that started with a mother's single tear and has grown into something that proves every day that the most profound connections are often born from the most heartbreaking circumstances. The lioness who waited for me with a cub and a single tear taught me that animals experience grief and hope with the same intensity as humans. Her tears opened a channel of communication that transcends language and has created possibilities that neither species could achieve alone. She showed me that sometimes the most important moments in life happen when we least expect them, and that stepping outside for a breath of fresh air can change everything we thought we knew about the world around us. Not her single tear became the foundation for a relationship that continues to save lives and build bridges between our species. Every time I see moisture in the eyes of a wild animal, I'm reminded that emotions are not uniquely human traits, but universal experiences that connect all mothers regardless of species. The lioness who cried for her dying cub changed both of our lives forever and created a legacy that proves tears can be the beginning of miracles, rather than just expressions of despair. I've been a wildlife researcher in Kenya's Amboseli National Park for 7 years, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found when I stepped outside my research cabin for a breath of fresh air at 11:47 p.m. on August 3rd, 2024. What I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you believe about the emotional depth of wild animals and the impossible lengths a mother will go to save her child. My name is Dr. Lisa Chun, and this is the story of a single tear that changed my understanding of animal consciousness forever. I had been working late analyzing behavioral data from the day's observations when the stuffiness of my small cabin became overwhelming. The African night was unusually quiet, no sounds of hyenas or distant elephant trumpeting, just an eerie silence that made me feel like I was the only living thing for miles. I opened my door, expecting to find the usual empty darkness of the savannah, but instead, I found myself face to face with something that made my blood freeze. Lioness was sitting exactly 10 meters from my door. She wasn't moving, wasn't pacing, wasn't showing any of the typical behaviors of a predator on the hunt. She was simply sitting there, like she had been waiting for me to appear. In 7 years of fieldwork, I had never encountered a wild lion so close to human habitation, and certainly never one that seemed to be deliberately seeking human contact. But she wasn't alone. At her feet lay a small cub, maybe 8 weeks old, and even in the dim light from my cabin, I could see something was terribly wrong. The tiny body was motionless. No playful movements, no curious exploration of the environment, no signs of the vibrant energy that defines healthy lion cubs. This little one was either unconscious or worse, and its mother was sitting vigil beside it. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could see more details of this impossible scene. The lioness was magnificent, despite her obvious distress. Her golden coat gleamed in the moonlight, and her muscular frame spoke of power and grace. But it was her face that stopped me cold. There in the corner of her left eye was something I had never seen on a wild predator. A single tear, crystal clear and unmistakable, catching the light from my cabin like a tiny diamond of grief. The tear wasn't from wind or dust or any physical irritation. It was too perfectly formed, too deliberately placed. This was an expression of pure emotion. A wild lioness was crying over her motionless cub, and she had somehow chosen my doorstep as the place to display her grief. The sight hit me like a physical blow. I was witnessing something that shouldn't exist, according to everything I had been taught about animal behavior. For several minutes, we stared at each other across the 10 meters of African night. The lioness made no aggressive moves, showed no signs of territorial behavior or predatory intent. She was simply waiting, watching, as if she expected me to understand something important about her presence. The single tear remained suspended in the corner of her eye, like a message written in the most primal language of all maternal despair. I knew I should retreat back into my cabin and wait for her to leave. Every safety protocol I had ever learned screamed at me to put distance between myself and a wild predator. But something about her posture, her expression, the way she seemed to be deliberately presenting her cub to me, made me hesitate. This wasn't random behavior. This lioness had come here with purpose, and that purpose somehow involved me. Slowly, carefully, I took a single step forward. The lioness didn't react with aggression or alarm. Instead, she tilted her massive head slightly, as if she was encouraging me to approach. The tear in her eye caught the light again, and I could see it was joined by moisture gathering in her other eye. She was crying. A wild apex predator was displaying grief in the most human way possible. Took another step, and then another, until I was within 5 meters of the lioness and her motionless cub. At this distance, I could see the full extent of the tragedy. The cub was a female with the most beautiful golden fur I had ever seen on a young lion. But her tiny chest was barely moving, and her breathing was so shallow it was almost undetectable. She was alive but barely clinging to life. The lioness made a soft sound. Not a roar or a growl, but something almost like a whimper. She was trying to communicate with me about her dying child. The sound was heartbreaking. It was the universal language of a mother in distress, asking for help from anyone who might be able to provide it. She had identified me as a potential source of assistance and was making her plea in the only way she knew how. I knelt down slowly, keeping my movements calm and predictable. The lioness watched every gesture, but showed no signs of aggression. When I was at ground level, she did something that defied every instinct she should have had. She gently pushed her cub toward me. A wild lioness was entrusting me with her most precious possession. She was asking me to save her baby's life. The cub was burning with fever and severely dehydrated. Her tiny tongue hung from her mouth, and her gums were pale and dry. There were no visible wounds or injuries, but she was clearly suffering from some kind of illness or poisoning. Without immediate medical intervention, she would be dead within hours. But I wasn't a veterinarian. I was a behavioral researcher with basic first aid training, facing a medical emergency that was beyond my expertise. Looked up at the lioness and saw that the single tear had been joined by others. Moisture was streaming down both sides of her face in a display of grief that was impossible to misinterpret. She was crying for her dying child, and somehow she believed I could help. The trust required for such an action was staggering. She had overcome millions of years of evolutionary programming to seek assistance from a member of the species that had been her enemy for millennia, made a decision that could have cost me my life. I gently lifted the dying cub and carried her into my cabin. The lioness followed me to the doorway, but didn't try to enter. She positioned herself where she could see through the window and began a vigil that would last for the next 18 hours. She was trusting me with her child, but she wasn't going to let her out of her sight. Inside my cabin, I worked frantically to stabilize the cub. I used my emergency medical supplies to treat her dehydration and fever. I administered electrolyte solutions through a small syringe and used cooling pads to bring her temperature down. Through my window, I could see the lioness hadn't moved. She was watching my every movement, making sure I was helping, not harming her baby. The next several hours were the longest of my life. The cub's condition was critical, and there were moments when I thought I was going to lose her. Her breathing became even more labored, and her heart rate was dangerously weak. But this little fighter had inherited her mother's determination. Slowly, gradually, she began to respond to treatment. Around dawn, the cub's fever finally broke. Her breathing became more regular, and she opened her eyes for the first time since her arrival. When she made a soft mewing sound, I felt relief wash over me like a physical force. I had done it. Against all odds, I had saved the life of a wild lion cub while her mother watched and trusted me to succeed. I stepped outside to update the lioness on her cub's progress. She immediately stood up and approached to within 2 meters of me. The tears were gone from her eyes, replaced by desperate hope. I held up the cub so she could see her baby was alive and alert. The lioness made a sound that can only be described as a sob of relief mixed with overwhelming gratitude. Over the next 2 days, the cub's recovery was remarkable. Her appetite returned, her playfulness emerged, and she began to show all the signs of a healthy young lion. But during this entire time, the lioness never left my property. She had taken up residence outside my cabin, creating a protective perimeter around the building. She was standing guard, making sure nothing could harm her cub while she recovered. On the third morning, I knew it was time for the reunion. The cub was fully recovered and ready to return to the wild. I carried her outside, and the lioness immediately approached. What happened next was one of the most beautiful things I have ever witnessed. The mother began grooming her cub, checking every inch of her tiny body, purring so loudly. I could feel the vibrations through the ground. But then the lioness did something that will stay with me forever. She looked directly at me and slowly lowered her massive head in what could only be interpreted as a bow of gratitude. She held that position for several seconds, making sure I understood her message. Then she picked up her healthy cub and began to walk toward the tree line. But after about 30 meters, she stopped, turned back, and made a sound that wasn't quite a roar. It was softer, more melodic. She was saying goodbye and thank you in the only way she knew how.